The South African Treasury says downsizing the country's defence force has been a costly exercise. In a briefing before the Defence Portfolio Committee, Mashudu Bidzha from the National Treasury revealed that spending on the SANDF outstripped spending on police, health, social protections and education. To discuss, I'm now joined by Tim Flack, who is the spokesperson of the SA National Defence Union. Tim, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this afternoon. Now, as a spokesperson of the SANDF Union, how do you respond to the recent revelation by Treasury that billions were spent on downsizing the SANDF? And what are your organization's views on the implications surrounding this significant expenditure?
Well, thanks for having me on the show. And there's certainly a few things that there's a little bit more to it than to say that costs are skyrocketing. And despite claims that SANDF salary costs, for example, are skyrocketing, salaries are largely kept stable, and they have been kept stable for quite some time. And they've only been adjusted mainly for inflation. But the real issue lies in when they shrink the overall defense budget. This makes salary costs seem disproportionately large, and that's what we're seeing here too. So not a full picture is being told. The other thing is, as the overall defense budget decreases every year, because this is what's been happening for many years, they keep decreasing it. The portion allocated to salaries naturally just seems to appear to be growing, and this is not due to an increase in salaries, but rather a shrinking of the pie. A concept that's often missed by often in the media and often in government themselves.
Now, the debt service cost, which is sitting at about 356 billion rands, is said to be one of the key explanations that have been provided for these substantial costs that have been incurred. How does the union assess the sufficiency and the outcomes of these expenditures in relation to strategic priorities of the defense force?
Well, what we do is we've been looking at other things as well that are sort of implicated in the problem, and things that are happening are, for example, operational costs from deployments. These are things that we're looking at, and also irregular expenditure and financial mismanagement. So one of the things is increasing SANDF deployments. This is happening more and more. There's more deployments happening, both domestically and internationally, and these are driving up costs to overtime, allowances, logistics, and these necessary operations further strain the defense budget, but are they're very much overlooked when assessing financial performance. And then the other one that we look at, and that we have looked at for quite some time, is the issue of rising costs being compounded by irregular expenditures and financial mismanagement within the Department of Defence themselves. And addressing this will obviously alleviate the pressure on the budget, and it makes it easier to point in certain directions and misdirect from what's actually going on the ground.
Speaking of those deployments, and we know one of the most notable ones are those within the DRC. How do these cost-cutting exercises really have an impact, especially on the morale of those that are on the ground?
It has a massive effect on soldiers themselves. Coming from a background of being a soldier myself, I had served in the SANDF between 2007 and 2012. I can tell you right now that when you go on a deployment and there isn't enough funds available for simple things like decent food, I mean, everyone knows that an army marches on their stomach. If you're not feeding guys properly, if you're not providing proper accommodations, even things like proper toilets, where they're having to dig certain kinds of ablution facilities for themselves. Certain things are happening in terms of base protections. So, for example, in the DRC, I'm told by people that some of the guys are even currently just worried about simple base defenses where the enemy is now targeting them on the base, and they're sleeping in tents, in trenches rather than in their tents, in their bunks, which would be a lot more comfortable, because they're worried a wayward mortar is going to hit their tent, or a grenade's going to hit them, or they're going to come under fire and they're not in a protected position. So these sort of things has a massive impact on morale with soldiers, and it's definitely something that needs to be looked at, because a well-funded and functional defense force is critical to maintaining not only national security and investor confidence, but these constant budget cuts risks undermining the SANDF's operational capabilities, and that's on these deployments, which could have a massive, broader security and economic consequence to the country.
I mean, the Department of Defense has also incurred unauthorized expenditure of about 2.9 billion in the 2022-23 financial year and 3.5 billion in the 2023-2024 financial year. Are these having dire impacts directly on the resources, especially of those soldiers that are on the ground in places like the DRC?
Absolutely, and I was discussing it with a few people earlier today that one of the problems that is seen to be having is that there's no consequences for this unauthorized expenditure, and not having any consequences to the people that are actually doing these kind of things is having a massive impact. People can be seen to be making mistakes, and then we sit with problems like this. But you've got the same people doing the same thing, making the same mistakes sometimes, or even purposefully continuing with unauthorized expenditure. And there needs to be consequences for these kind of actions, and possibly education. I mean, we're sitting with generals in places that sometimes shouldn't be in these areas where people with more expertise or better training need to be in these places.
Do you think this will have an overall impact in the future, especially in attracting more people to this profession?
I think so. I think it's already having an impact on it. A lot of what ends up happening is that people end up joining the defense force because they think that it's possibly just a way for a salary, and then you end up with lower quality people coming in. But also your highly skilled guys, your officers, the guys with degrees, people that are wanting to make a decent career out of it. I know, for example, a lot of people that I went to school with when I left school to join the defense force. A lot of my buddies ended up going to places like the French Foreign Legion or the UK Army, where they saw prospects as being better for them. And the SANDF, for example, is becoming not so good because they're cutting down on the size of the force too. So people are worried also about there's not enough money being spent on recruitment either. So we're having people standing in queues to join the SANDF for 10 years, sometimes 5 years, waiting just to hear an answer, and by then it's too late.
How can the downsizing process within the SANDF be managed in a manner that minimizes negative impacts? Are there any alternatives?
I think that the defense minister and her deputies need to get professionals in and get people who are experts in the field. There are many experts in the military fraternity that can give good advice on these sort of things, and it's okay for them, and it's okay for people within the SANDF to say, listen, we haven't got the capabilities to be able to handle this properly. Let's put our heads together, let's get people in that can help us, and we can actually rescue things before they get out of hand, before we end up with a dysfunctional SANDF. Because if we don't have a balanced approach towards defense funding, and then end up just focusing on things, and in Treasury just focusing on things like salary costs and skyrocketing salary costs, government should consider tightening financial governance, managing operational expenditures better, and ensuring that the critical defense functions remain adequately funded to maintain national security. And having people that know how to do these things is key to doing that.